Hi, we will continue the discussion that we've had last 10 minutes now on the mic. Good evening. We're joined with people you've known and have heard in various other panels and talks, Eric Toussaint and Bernard Cassen and Samir Amin. And the topic tonight is social forums, Occupy, and I think we will extend it to what Samir added to the connection between those two and the electoral process, or the unspoken connection between the two. And the discussion that we just had here was how the very first social forum and discussions that led to it from Paris to Brazil were actually held with PT, the party in Brazil. And maybe Bernard can make a small introduction about this link and about the coalition of social movements and the electoral side of hosts in Brazil.
Good evening or good afternoon, I don't know. It's the first World Social Forum took place in Brazil in January 2001. And the decision to launch it was taken only a few months before. And this is how it happened. I was in Paris at the time. I was Director General of Le Monde Diplomatique, and I received two Brazilian comrades and friends, Chico Whitaker and Oded Grajev, and they were returning from Davos. And they were shocked, of course, by Davos. And they said to me, we should do something against Davos, organize a sort of counter Davos. And I said the year before, and Samir was there too, the World Forum for Alternatives had organized a sort of counter Davos in Davos. But it's nearly impossible to organize anything in such a small city with hundreds of grandees of all sorts and the Swiss police. But we did it. And the year after, then in 2000, I said to Oded and Chico, it's ridiculous to organize something in Switzerland or even in France, because we are in the same continent. If we really want to do something different, it must be somewhere in the world, but not in Europe or in the United States. And I said, when we examine the different possible countries, the one which seems best appropriate is Brazil. Why Brazil? Because of the existence of popular movements, of a party, of the PT, of many organizations. And in Brazil, where? I suggested Porto Alegre. It could have been Belo Horizonte or São Paulo or any other city, but it just happened that I had studied the participatory budget of Porto Alegre, and I thought that it was a good symbol to organize something in a city where they had put in practice this participatory budget. And we decided that at that stage that the forum should call itself World Social Forum as opposed to the World Economic Forum of Davos. So it began as an anti-Davos outfit. And then our Brazilian comrades organized themselves. I went to Brazil several times afterwards, and finally they did it. And it was really extraordinary, because the decision taken in May for a World Social Forum found its outcome, its result, in January 2001. So at the beginning it was an anti-Davos. In Davos, we have bankers or banksters, governments, businessmen, all sorts of men. And they meet not only in Davos, but in many other venues. But there was at the time no existing space for social movements of the whole world, organizations, trade unions to meet. So the forum was a forum of organizations, not of individuals. There were individuals, but as members of organizations, which is totally different from the Occupy movement. And when you asked me about the relationship with politics, so when we said it might be in Porto Alegre in January, of course, all the Brazilians who formed the organizing committee were members or close to the PT, but they didn't have the backing of the PT. They were members of the CUT, of the Mouvement des Dissenters, etc. So when the idea progressed, Lula, who was not president at the time, not yet, asked me to come and meet him because he wanted to know exactly what we meant with the Social Forum. Would it be against the party, against the PT, or not? And I gave him the example of Attac, which was, at the time I was president of Attac, France. I explained to him how we functioned. That is a social movement which makes proposals, which doesn't intend to replace parties, which acts on a different sphere, in a different sphere. And he understood fairly well, and he gave us the green light. We were speaking with Eric. If we hadn't had the green light of Lula of PD, we could have organized it anyway, and if not in Porto Alegre, in some other city of Brazil, or perhaps in Mexico or another country. But it was better to have the PT with us, though they kept at a distance. They provided, the city of Porto Alegre and the government of Rio Grande do Sul provided considerable financial and logistical assistance. Without them, it would have been much more difficult. But they did help, but they didn't try, and that's much to their credit, they didn't try to influence, to say we want this or that. No, they left us alone. There was sufficient confidence with them, between them and us, for them not to try to manage to control everything. But of course, during the forum, Lula was invited in several not round tables, because they was in an immense room. There was in Gigantino, which is a gymnasium which can accommodate 20,000 persons. He was one of the, if not the leading star of the forum, but keeping a distance as a party from the social movements. It was a bit complicated because in the PT, not everyone, there were disagreements within them. Some were closer to the leadership, others were less close, but we managed, and it started like that. And one phrase I often use is the following, referring to Aldo Moro's, the Italian prime minister who was assassinated by the Red Brigades, when he said once that between the Communist Party, the Italian Communist Party, and Christian democracy, there should be parallel convergences. Normally, parallels never converge. But you can have, on the one hand, social movements who advocate this or that measure, and on the other hand, in a parallel way, so political parties which go in the same direction, each in its own separate line. And I think this could apply as well to the Occupy movement, but we'll discuss that later.
Thank you. Samir, you also took part for a long, long time in those events. And
I don't think that I have anything to add because...
Yes, I thought we can move on.
Yeah.
Because maybe perhaps if just one sentence.
Oh, no, okay. Does it work? Yeah. Thank you. No, I don't think that I have anything to add to what Bernard has said because it's a very short but more than correct, a very lightening of how the process. No, I want to stress on a political problem, which is the considerable distance which separates the strength of the struggles, I would call them the struggles rather than movements, movements in struggle, the struggles, and the results, if we call them so, coming out of electoral processes. Now, I'll take one example because it's a striking example, the one of Egypt, but I think that that could be said also of other examples, such as France or Greece, with due respect to the specificities and differences, of course. Now, in Egypt, we had a gigantic popular movement in struggle with a variety, a lot have been written and analyzed, of the various social, political, ideological components of it, and the demands which in some cases, or in many cases, were very concrete and radical. Radical in the sense that it could not be achieved unless you have a total change in the balance of force nationally and at the regional and perhaps even global level. And I'll come to that point later. You know, in a country even of 85 million people, when 15 million people are mobilized during 2 weeks, 24 hours, day and night, occupying the whole country, that's not a small thing. And those people were not just plagued by occupying with a few vague slogans. They had, many of them, but they are the minority in the country, in the society, but a strong minority which is the active minority, and that's very important. And then, what was the strategy of the reactionary forces and of the US? A strategy of let us have this transition as quick as possible, ending with elections. And we had elections. And the elections gave the result, as you know, that is 60% reactionary political Islam, the majority, and only 40% for representative, diluted representative of the struggles. Well, that's normal. It was expected. It was expected. Nothing abnormal. Because elections, the rule of, the so-called rule of majority means elections have always a very conservative dimension. It is preventing the minority of becoming the majority through the continuation and deepening of the struggles. I mean, when I say we, quite a number, but a large number of people in Egypt, we don't believe in what Lenin called in his time parliamentary cretinism. We don't believe that once a parliament has been elected, he set the rules and you have to play within the rules. No. Play within the rules and outside of the rules through struggles in order for what are the minority, but the minority which was the active minority mobilizing the whole country. Now, why was it so in the concrete case of Egypt? But as I said, we could take the case of France or the case of Greece also, or any case, but perhaps, or even in some Latin American countries, such as Brazil, for instance. The active minority had is living in a society which has been destroyed throughout 40 years. I'll speak later, perhaps, if we have to speak of long waves, of not neoliberal policy and glorious growth within neoliberal policies, the World Bank blah blah and the European Commission blah blah and so on, but lumpen development. That is, the official statistics says in Egypt that 60% of the Egyptian people are surviving in the non-informal sectors and so on and so forth. That was a strategy. We ought to know that the enemy has a strategy, which is called in that case development, but it's not development, it's lumpen development, the target of which being to prevent a country, a dangerous country like Egypt, to become a so-called emerging country, which could be competing in political sense, not competing necessarily only on trade. And that strategy was developed, and this is why we should connect the problem of this distance between the results in electoral terms with the geostrategy. The three intimate allies, the US, Israel, and the Gulf countries, their major target since 40 years was to prevent a renaissance of Egypt. Egypt moving on, being up on its feet. And through financing a lumpen development. That financing of lumpen development with the money of the Gulf, with the support of the US aid, the moral support of the Europeans, and some money, of course, from them also, was financing that spiral down, a process of pauperization and pauperization. And it is through this process of pauperization that the reactionary political Islam, represented the Muslim Brotherhood, could have an objective basis, because they are partners in that. They are financing this spiral of pauperization of surviving activities, and therefore they could have an easy electoral majority, which is reflecting exactly the opposite of what the gigantic popular movement was demanding. So we have to understand that now, I said, and I will not be as long, of course, I will just one sentence. I think there is a distance between the results, and many people in France who have voted for Hollande want much more than they know that they could expect from Hollande. And even if Syriza in Greece has been a very good advance, and I'm very happy of that, I'm sure that many of the Greeks who want more than what could come and has not come, but
what Syriza can offer.
The elections. Elections are always giving a prime to conservative forces. Never forget that.
Thanks, Samir. Eric, given that we touched on the economic side of it as well, but I'll let you develop your own thread of thought for this relationship between social movements and how much ground we covered from social forums to something to occupy, which did not happen in reaction to Davos in terms of being a conscious effort of some progressive forces to join together and do something, but it was the actual people's reaction to harsh economic conditions which have emerged since the 2000 and since the years of the boom of another wave of capitalism, from .com to the later development. So I wonder what's your take on that?
Thank you. I'm very happy to be with you this evening. Yes, taking into account what Bernard said about creation of the World Social Forum and seeing in the direction of what happened in 2011, maybe we could say that the process of the World Social Forum was a construction from above, and the movement in 2011 was a spontaneous movement of masses occupying the public space, and clearly we will see the relation between politics, electoral electoral process, and how the bourgeoisie will try to stabilize the situation in its favor. But going to the past, I would mention the following things. I see that from, I would say, 1999 until 2003 included, we had a period of huge anti-neoliberal mobilization, beginning with Seattle, but maybe we could go including in the previous year, because we have to mention, and I participate to that, of the initiative of the Zapatista in Mexico with the Subcomandante Marcos, who convoked in 96, and it was provocative, an intergalactic gathering against neoliberalism. And we were something like 8,000 delegates from all over the world in the forest of Chiapas with the guerrilla of the ZLN. But we have so a huge amount of big mobilization. 99, 2000 against the World Bank in Washington, in Prague in September 2000, and we had also big mobilization after January 2001 with the World Social Forum, when we went to Genoa in July 2001 against the G8, and after that the huge mobilization of February 2003 against the war decided and prepared by the US and its allies against Iraq, which began in March 2003. During this period, we had the World Social Forum at a very important process, at least for West Europe and Latin America. And it began to expand in 2003, 2004, to South Asia. There has been a South Asian Social Forum in 2003, and we moved from the World Social Forum from Porto Alegre to Mumbai, India, in January 2004, and it was a very important success. But something that I want to raise, and it has a relation with the question of relation between social movement and government and parties inside the government. We entered, I think, in the first stage of a crisis inside the World Social Forum process, because in two major countries for the process, Italy was in Europe the main country with huge mobilization against neoliberalism, etc., and the process in Genoa and in Firenze, in Florencia, in November 2002 was very important. And in Brazil, we had the election of Lula in 2002. He took the presidency in 2003. And so what happened? Several social movements who were very important for the process, the CUT in Brazil, the trade union, including the MST of the peasants, began to have a complex relation with the government, and in some aspects subordination to the government of Lula, who was not making a rupture with really, at the profound level, with neoliberalism. It transformed neoliberalism in social liberalism with assistantialism, etc. And some part of the movement was integrated in this process. And in Italy, we had the experience of the Prodi government, in which we had a part of the ex-Communist Party, the Social Democrats, the new Social Democrats, but also the Communist Refundation, the radical left, who entered the government. And so the social movement also in Italy entered in a process of confusion, crisis, etc. And it is linked also with an evolution of the World Social Forum, institutionalization of the World Social Forum, because they were including big interest. An example, very concrete example, and I imagine that Bernard remembered that, and I don't know if Samir was in the same meeting, but when we discuss inside the International Council of the World Social Forum to move to India, okay, it was a big debate. The representative of the city came to the meeting asking us to discuss, and it was the opposition, not the PT, because the opposition, neoliberal opposition, gains the election against the PT. But they came telling us, you know, we could give you $1 million if you convoke the next social forum in January 2004 in Porto Alegre again. Please don't go to Mumbai. Why? Because if you gather 12,000 foreigners who are coming and 100,000 people of Brazil, yes, it's for the industry of hotels, restaurants, tourism. It's big money. So the neoliberal government wanted to convince us, giving us, not for ourselves, but for the budget of the World Social Forum, $1 million to convince us to organize this activity. So we had some institutionalization of it, and it was a good decision to move to Mumbai, where the comrades of India decided to refuse to receive any money from private foundation like Rockefeller and Ford Foundation, and they didn't receive any money from the government. And we succeed in organizing a big gathering with 130,000 people, and with the president of the Dalits and the radical movement. But at the same time, the movement was beginning to be institutionalized, and we, after February 2003, we had not any more big and huge, massive mobilization like the mobilization against the war. So, coming now to what happened in 2011, I would say 2011 at a world scale is a re-emergence of massive protest movement, beginning with Tunisia and extending to Egypt, and what is very interesting is the influence of the protest in North Africa, which influenced Europe, because it extended to Portugal in March 2011, later in May 2011 in Spain, in Syntagma and the Occupy movement of Greece, also in May, June, in July, August in Israel, something very particular, and from the Mediterranean Sea through the continent, it goes through the Atlantic Ocean to the east coast of the United States, Wall Street, and the Wall Street Occupy movement began in July 2011. So really, 2011 was a very important year at the level of the possibility of the mass movement, and we succeeded the 15th of October to organize for the first time. Through there was no leadership of that, no commando. It was a decision of the Spaniards to convoke a new movement for the 15th of October, and it was a big success in several countries, not all over the world, but at least in 80 countries there were mobilization and massive mobilization, principally in Spain and in the US and several other countries. Not in France, not in Italy, something in Roma, but very complicated because a big violence provoked by Berlusconi government, etc. Okay, so now, in the new situation, effectively, I would say, the question of how to relate more or less spontaneous process with electoral process, with government who have some legitimacy, for instance, in Tunisia, but with the perspective of the government to keep on with neoliberal policy, stabilizing a bourgeois regime, democratic but bourgeois and neoliberal regime, well connected with the World Bank and IMF, etc. So how will we do with this process? And at this level, I propose to follow the discussion and given some interesting input.
Yes, thanks a lot, Eric. So we will continue on the thread of thought of, I think, a couple of issues. It's up to you how you follow it. But one is that I witnessed maybe a couple of important points of social movements. One is 2004 in London, where the situation would have fell apart if there was no Ken Livingstone, mayor of London, who decided, yes, okay, I'll fund it because it's too important. But he first let the social movements fight for a while until they realized we're without money. We can't really pull it off on our own. So that was a huge importance of electoral process and funds available. And then another one was in 2000, maybe 1 or 2, with the Indie Media Network at the time that I worked after Seattle, where Ford Foundation offered us $500,000. And it was such a shocking proposal for something that came out of Seattle, that Genoa and Prug events at the time protest, that we couldn't even publicly speak it. We couldn't even internally discuss it. It had to be a special closed group that would discuss the issue. It was so controversial. We can see it here in the region for 20 years. We've had foreign funds directing strongly the results of the elections and giving people access to funds. So that's one thread of thought. So I'm wondering, for France, I guess that's less of a problem.
What?
Well, the fact that the foreign funds can direct outcome of the electorate. But what I wonder for France is the electoral process always bound to disappoint social movements, no matter, or struggles, which is a better way to say it, no matter how we, can the link be made? Can something like Attac and SocialForums ever had its own role in a different form of formulating government, no?
Well, it's quite clear that World Social Forums do not scare, do not terrify neoliberal authorities. And the anecdote which Eric has mentioned is very typical. And the mayor of Porto Alegre was completely right, because he thought it was a good bargain to offer $1 million and in exchange receive tens of thousands of foreign tourists. For the city, it was good. But that meant that the World Social Forum could be accommodated within the limits of the institutions. Which is not to say that the forums are useless. I think they have become more institutionalized. They are a sort of fair, like there is a Fête de l'Humanité in France every year. You have delegates, more and more representatives of NGOs, and less of social movements, which is a problem. But it can be useful. Do they have an influence on national politics? I would say no. Because many times I have seen in World Social Forums, and particularly in Brazil, French politicians and trade unions agree on bold initiatives, bold ideas, but when they return home with a 10-hour flight makes these promises or these claims useless. They forget them. So they can agree in Porto Alegre, but disagree when back in Paris or wherever it is. Now you ask me about the expectations of the French in terms of in electoral terms. Well, I think that the people, and the French in particular, do not really care whether this is a reform, a revolution, the bourgeois. No, they want change. And the victory of Hollande was not a victory for the ideas of Hollande, but it was a victory against Sarkozy. The 2/3 of the people who voted for our new president didn't vote for him, but they voted against Sarkozy. They wanted to oust Sarkozy. We could no longer bear the mere presence of Sarkozy. It's exceptional that such a leader provokes such a reaction or such a rejection. And the victory was narrow, 3 points between the two. Now, are we going to be disappointed? It's quite likely, because but we breathe better after Sarkozy is out, and that cannot be neglected. And I said we may be disappointed. Why? Because in the next few weeks and the next few months, Hollande will have to make decisions, very important decisions, which could make of him either a French Roosevelt or a French Papandreou. I think the logic of his history would be to become a Papandreou. But circumstances may create a situation in which he would be obliged to go the other way. Why? Because on the problem of the euro, on the problem of the bailout of Greece, or the supposed bailout of Greece, Spain, Portugal, Italy, maybe Ireland, very important decisions will have to be made. Either he surrenders to the present logic, and at the moment when we speak, he's having dinner with Chancellor Merkel. We'll know what they said perhaps tomorrow, but either he surrenders, or he breaks with the logic which is at the moment proposed, or rather imposed by Germany. I am one who thinks that the euro is going to explode somehow or other. But there are other solutions. But even if Hollande disappoints us, the mere fact that we no longer have Sarkozy, you cannot imagine how better we feel.
I think a lot of us in different countries who voted people out share your feelings. But Samir, before you continue, just one small intervention. If we can't expect much from electoral politics because it always betrays, because it always reduces struggles of movements, and I think that we can't plausibly think of an armed struggle and revolutionary taking of the power today, or even if we did, what would we do? I mean, what would you do to give those social...
We'll have some time to come to this problem more properly. I think I'll come back to my region, because I think it's a key region. It's not by arrogance because I'm coming from that region, but it's objectively. It's not by pure chance that 1990, immediately after the fall, the breakdown of the Soviet Union, the series of wars started in the region, the first Gulf War, and then the invasion of Iraq, and then Afghanistan, and then now perhaps Syria and Iran, etc., etc. Because whether correct or not, I think it's correct, the US establishment analyzes the major conflict at global level, the conflict between the US imperialism and behind it its subaltern allies of NATO, Europe, on the one hand, and the emerging countries, and in particular China, on the other hand, and has to prepare the terrain for and through preemptive wars. They have called them preemptive wars. Now, but in that frame, they were not expecting, the U.S. establishment was not expecting the Egyptian uprising. They were surprised by Tunisia and Egypt. They did not expect it. You have to just read the reports of the CIA on Egypt and how optimistic they were just before. They were surprised. But they learned from that. And they have now a new strategy vis-à-vis the region, which is to preempt the movement by starting the movement themselves. That is starting with supporting, there are small groups, or importing from outside, exporting small groups which claim to be the liberators and call NATO the same day to the rescue. They have done this strategy. implemented that strategy, defined it, and implemented it successfully in the case of Libya. We have no time to discuss why it was so easy in the case of Libya, but they have, and they are trying it with Syria. That is through Turkey. Turkey, when I'm in Latin America, I'm saying to the Latin American friends, if you want to understand what is Turkey, it's the Colombia of the Middle East, and they understand immediately what it means. A major NATO power, and through them, in alliance with the Muslim Brotherhood and the reactionary political Islam, pretend to and preempt the thing. That is, what is the target of that strategy? The target of that strategy, of course, is nothing like democracy. In Libya, it's a process of disintegration of the society on the Somalian type, and not of democracy of any kind. In Iraq, they have replaced the dictatorship by 3 uglier dictatorships, and they have organized the systematic assassination of tens of thousands of all the cadres, not the political cadres. Those political cadres, they turn their vest, but all the scientists, all the researchers and so on, and even all a good number of poets. That's indicative. Now, the target of the strategy of imperialism is to destroy those countries, destroy them. That is, destroying the state, having the Libyan, Somalian type of, or destroying Iraqi type, or destroying the state, destroying the nation, we could say, destroying the society. You know, and what is the consequence of that? In order to, that continues the spiral of lumpen development for the region. They have nothing else to propose to the region. Lumpen development financed by and supported by reactionary political Islam and financed by the Gulf, which reinforce them and so on. This is their strategy. And we ought to see it because we can see in the case of Syria, fortunately, it is not successful, the strategy of the US and Europe in Syria. It's not successful until now, but it could be, because the alternative would be for, I don't know what it means, the regime or not the regime, come into real negotiations with the real democratic and popular movement, which has not gone into alliance with the Western, pro-Western agents, I would call them, on the one hand, without also subscribe to support the regime as it is. Now, so we are in a very complex situation, and complex situation in the sense that you cannot separate the strategies, the tactics, the targets of the popular mobilization, absolutely legitimate popular mobilization for moving out of this lumpen development into a starting a real alternative which respond to the demands of the people and so on. You cannot dissociate that from the strategy of global imperialism. You cannot, and particularly in the region, but I think that you cannot elsewhere also, even if it doesn't seem as dramatic as in that case. From here we could move to the question that you raised. I mean, is the movement able to invent new forms of organization, of action, strategic targets which could bring together the majority of the movement, and able to manage the tactics also. This is a very complex set of problems. Now, again, in the case of Egypt, the movement had started inventing something which was given a name, the Parliament of the People. The Parliament of the People, which was meeting, was conglomerate of organizations, political parties, from communists to bourgeois, middle class rather than bourgeois, democratic, with peasant movements, with trade unions, with youth movement, with women's movements, etc., etc., which could have developed into something better organized. And the people used to say that the elected parliament is the parliament of money, necessarily. And the parliament of the people is something different, and this is what we want. Now, this has unfortunately not developed. There was a good start in May, June last year, and then perhaps because there were some illusions about the shift towards the electoral debate, but I hope, and I have discussed that a lot of time recently, that this will come again and perhaps make a step ahead, which means that we have to be very demanding from the popular movements in struggle, and they are facing terrible challenge, and they cannot invent those forms of organization, action, strategic targets, invent the political ways of being able to guide tactically even the battles. You need that. And simultaneously associate all that with understanding what is the strategy and what is the steps taken by the enemy, by not only capitalism in abstracto, but global capitalism and imperialism and European imperialism, because in that case Europe is completely aligned. And I was saying that Juppé could be the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Hollande, a good one, because they all agree on that. And that's very important. In France, I think that the debate cannot be limited to French questions or French European questions about how to move out of austerity in the frame of France and Europe, but also has to take the global dimension. And here it would clash with the US, with NATO, and so on. And you cannot separate those issues.
Thank you.
Yes. To make this. Yes, there is very little likelihood that France will break with NATO, unfortunately. There is something I want to say about the Occupy movement. The Occupy movement, the indignant movement, because the example came basically from our neighbor, which is Spain, is very weak in France. It mobilizes a few hundred people, not more. Why? Because there was, we were on the eve of an election which was perceived as very important. So the more expectations you have about the radical break coming from an election, and the less people mobilize in the streets for, in particular, for the indignant movement. Of course, as I said before, they risk being disappointed. But it means that electoral politics are not finished. The turnout at the election, at the presidential election, was more than 80%, which is extremely high. Because a few months before, people said, pollsters said, the abstention will be unprecedented, 30-35%. No, people went to the polls, and in the majority voted for Hollande. So, and this was marked. One of the features, the main features of the election was the emergence of a new force on the left, the so-called left front, whose candidate was Jean-Luc Mélenchon, which pretends at the same time to base its policies on the wishes of social movements and be in power, in office. they do not, the left front wants to govern France, which is not the case of extreme left-wing parties who would refuse to participate in any government. So there are expectations. It remains to be seen if they are going to be fulfilled or not. But I wouldn't overestimate the victory of Hollande, but we cannot underestimate it either. And I discussed, in spite of all what Samir said, like me, he voted for Mélenchon in the first ballot.
Yeah. I am even perhaps more optimistic than him. I think that Hollande may, I hope so, but may be more courageous than I expected him to be.
we really, thanks, but we have to move from the French election. But as we can see, the situations are quite different. And when we speak of Egypt, there is the question of imperialism, the question of funding. When we talk of France, there is a question of being an imperial power still with its own right, regardless of,
Imperialism is not only for the victims, it's also
yes,
countries which are
But back closer to the starting topic, to Eric. So if we are stuck, like both of them said, and we cannot expect social movements and social struggles to be enacted in set of policies or in set of victories in the parliamentary struggle, then what can 99% when it arises in any form or shape, be it square in Egypt or in US, what can 99% expect? How does it formulate, and what Mm-hmm. We can't just be stuck forever. There has to be some way to progress in demands.
Yes. It's clear that there are common characteristics between the movement in North Africa, like in Tunisia and Egypt, and the Occupy movement and Indignatus movement. That the common characteristic is, for instance, the occupation of the public space. So it's not so through big strikes, because of the precarity of the situation of a lot of exploited people, the way of making or re-emerging on the public scene was not through traditional instrument of struggle like the strikes, but occupying permanently the public space and telling to the government in the case of the dictatorship in the case of Tunisia and Egypt, dégage. So you have to the power, you should go dismissed and go out of the power. It's a common characteristic in some way with the indignators, the occupation movement in Plaza Syntagma and other cities in Greece, and also the Occupy movement in United States, and also the movement we had in Israel in July and August, but which was not a radical one, etc., but the same type of way of expressing himself. There are differences, clear. In the case of Tunisia and Egypt, it was to overthrow a dictatorship. In the case of Europe, like Spain, Greece, or the United States, the principal enemy is the bankers, the banks, and for a part of the movement, the system, the capitalist system. And that's very positive, no? That's in the situation of the movement of 2011 and 2012, the clear perception that who are the responsibles of the crisis. The capitalists, and first, for the majority, the bankers and the government who are complice to the bankers. And so for a part of the movement, the capitalist system. So it is positive. The problem is how to prolong, to deepen the process. When you have more or less a spontaneous movement with a type of organization which refuse to delegate power. And that's really complicated. Friends who participate to the assembly in Occupy Wall Street told me it was very concrete, complicated situation. People didn't want it to plan any decision. So they want to take daily decision on all the questions, including the budget, to buy the food, to prepare the food for the people who were occupying and living in a camp. And so each day, people came to the assembly to listen to people who propose what is the decision for the next day. It's very complicated to make a political project if on a daily basis you have to discuss what you will do tomorrow. You need some planification, you need some project. It's also complicated if you do not elaborate a list of demands. And so a part of the movement say we don't want to elaborate a list of demands. We want to debate, to understand, and to protest. So now, inside the movement, for instance, in Spain, there is progress because they elaborate with a commission, economic commission or other commission, some demands, some platform, etc. So it will be very important. The other question is the relation between the movement and political parties, and radical left political parties. In several countries, the radical left political parties are totally marginal in relation with this dynamic, I mean in Spain and partly in Greece, partly. So at this level, the relation between electoral process and this dynamic, I would say what seems to me important, because there is a relation, including in France. What was important for me, a part of what Bernard said, to add something, is the huge amount of people in the meetings, in the debates. 10,000 of people, or when Mélenchon asked the people to mobilize themselves in La Bastille, 100,000 people mobilized. So people want to be together in the public space, including during an electoral campaign. That's a new thing, and that's very important. Okay, in Greece, what it seems to me very important is Syriza, with Alexis Tsipras, took a very radical way of making proposal to the public. Mélenchon did something like that, but not in the same condition like in Greece. Mélenchon speak about citizen revolution and taking, in some aspects, the experience of Ecuador and Venezuela. But Tsipras, what he made very concrete thing in relation with the crisis in Greece, is to say, we have to stop all the austerity plan, we have to cut the relation with the Troika, we have to suspend the payment of the external debt and organizing an audit of the debt to identify the legitimate debt, we have to audit the banks, and we have to eliminate the immunity of the political leaders of the traditional parties, because they should be sued for what they have done with Greece in the last decade. So this provoked really a massive support. You know that Syriza, you could say they have only 17%, but they are the main parties for the people between 18 and 55 years old. And they are the main parties in all the big cities. So that's really something important related to the proposal of Tsipras. So the question is whether Tsipras will keep on with this radical proposal of will he be submitted to all the pressure. Now the pressure in Greece on him and on the leadership of Syriza are very huge, and the bourgeoisie and the traditional party knows one thing: if there are new elections, Syriza will have 25% of the vote. So they try to avoid the election. But in case of election, what they try to do is to say, if you vote Syriza, you vote the way out of the Eurozone. And they say that in the polls, the Greek people are not, the majority is not favorable of going out of the Eurozone. So they try to identify Syriza with, to try to afraid a part of the people who could vote Syriza, but to say, if you vote Syriza, Greece will be expulsed. Or Syriza will decide to go out of the Eurozone, and you don't want that. So please don't vote in favor of Syriza. Vote any else party, but not Syriza. So we will see if Syriza could maintain a radical option and try to build something. But it's clear that it's not only one party who could change the situation. It's a relation between the mass movement and the political party and coalition and how to make a bloc with Antarcia, the coalition of the extreme left and other political parties, and how to relate it with the mass movement, which is highly complicated in the concrete situation of Greece.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Eric. Are we able to open the floor here and to get the mic around if people have some? Yeah. Yes. It's you can say, but it's got to be reasonably short, so we have the time to still to. You have there's a mic there, so you can just grab one.
You see the
no. They will switch them on.
I was very happy with the title of our round table, which was The Long Waves. And I think that indeed...
Jan.
My reading of the 20th century was the first long wave, which started not only with the Russian Revolution, even started before 1905, which prepared 1917, but 1911 in China, which prepared the year, and etc., etc. We had a long wave of a first series of attempts to move out of capitalism, all starting from peripheries. Russia, semi-periphery, periphery, call it as you want, China, etc., etc. And even if diluted with the national liberation movement, more or less radical, here and there in Asia and Africa. And almost nothing in the centers. In the sense that, yes, you had something, and something very important and positive in history, real social democracy. But real social democracy came because created by the possibility, created because there was this wave. If not the danger of communism, in inverted comma, there would have been no social democracy. But also it happened, and we ought not to forget that, the 30 years of glorious decades after World War II and social democracy were the 30 years of energy at zero price, free oil. That is super imperialism, imperialist plunder. Now, it is precisely because the first wave was almost exclusively in the peripheries and nothing radical, nothing important in the centers, that it came out of breath. And I would put Yugoslavia also as a semi-periphery of that kind. out of breath, and then moving into growing contradiction and breaking down. Now the challenge, the enormous challenge for us, is will the second wave, which is starting in the north and in the south, which is starting in different ways, but is starting in many places, if not everywhere, will this second wave be better than the first one? Now, that is, will it be more possible to establish a strategic coordination between changes in the south, if we call it so, and changes in the north? Now, that is crucial for both. I think that we would have a remake of the 20th century if we don't have that moving. And I don't see it moving fast enough. Because I think we have to, and it cannot be, and this is coming back to the question of imperialism, it cannot be established, this link, this organic link between the struggles without taking into account the imperialist dimension. Imperialist dimension is not only for the victims, it's also operating within the imperialist centers, and it is always operating to the benefit of, let's say, a consensus which, or a semi-consensus which is favorable to the continuation of the domination of capital. And that is the challenge, and we ought to discuss that, the second long wave, yes, beyond what is happening here and there, and we should discuss it, of course, but beyond that, how to, there are major theoretical issues, not theoretical in the academic sense, political theoretical issues which are related to how this second long wave could move ahead. I call it revolutionary advances, not revolutions, which solve all the problems in 24 hours, but revolutionary advances both in the north and in the south, or in the south and in the north, which would create the conditions to move simultaneously beyond capitalism and beyond imperialism. And again, we cannot dissociate capitalism from imperialism.
Thank you, Samir. Can we get the mic to whoever wishes to make brief comments and perhaps questions, but I will filter the questions, so if people have the questions that I find irrelevant, then I will ask the speakers to not address them, because, well, we can take it as you wish. Please, brief, please.
Briefly. Good evening. I have a question. We were wondering how we can, basically coming from the street to power, or can we do with a social forum influence politics or make a change, let's say. My question is, in Europe, actually, we have a supranational identity which is based in Brussels or Strasbourg, and actually it was made by, let's call it a bourgeois government, in order to rule at least the economy in European Union. So I see here a perfect tool to impose or to take power or to influence national policy or to make a breakthrough regarding what we want to achieve and the possibility of doing it. What do you think about this kind of regional policy, kind of international, as Marx used to say it?
We'll take a few more, so so people can choose what they decide to address.
Yes, hi, good evening. Thank you for your presentations. I would like to connect a few things. We were talking a lot about Europe and what's wrong with Europe, and we are discussing the social movements now. And I was just thinking, I would like to hear your comments on the fact that we have the world social movement, and we also have the European social movement, which is in a big crisis. And some people actually said last year in Istanbul that the European social movement is quite dying. And at the same time, we have other type of movements like indignados. So I would just like to hear your comments about what do you think? Why is that? Is it really happening? Is the European social movement dying? And if so, why so? Thank you very much.
Are there any more comments?
Hello. Having taken part in the Occupy movement, I have maybe the reading of it that maybe the event of the Occupy movement was that we met as the 99%. We said we are the 99%, and now we meet, now we talk about politics, about laws, about the circumstances in elections, and that's a possible reading maybe, and I'd like to hear your thoughts of that and how to develop from that position that we are now in, because maybe there has been an opening in the discourse because of this event that we met as the 99% or as normal citizens. And then maybe if you have some reflections on the Invisible Committee in France and the Situationists and Guy Debord and Adbusters and Kalle Lassen, because that is maybe the founding philosophy of the Occupy movement, as it was Adbusters inviting to the protest in the first place. Thanks.
One more in the back.
Hi. We know that one of the big democratic tools that are at our disposal is the internet, and we know also that there are many Google groups, many mailing lists, many newsletters, many websites, and also many internet platforms of communication with slight changes of views, slight divisions between the people. And is there any attempt to create like a global network, one big global network parallel to the World Social Forum, or do you think that it would be possible to create such a network that would operate above the divisions and that could communicate people from different parts of the world? Okay, thank you.
Any more before we start answering? I think there's plenty of material, so can we start with Bernard and Eric and Samir last?
I am not quite sure I understood the first question about the European institutions. Did you say that we should have to take over these institutions?
Actually, yes. I mean, in the sense that it looks to me easier than to take a local government, if we may say so, in terms of election.
I don't think so, because first you have the treaties. The treaties, and the latest one is the Lisbon Treaty, have locked in the impossibility to take power democratically. I mean, take the institutions. The Council is a meeting of governments elected each in its nation. The Commission is appointed and doesn't answer to anyone. The Parliament is elected. But there is no possibility of taking power at that level if you have not taken power at national level. So I just don't see the possibility of that. Now, the European social movement. I think there is no such thing as a European social movement, personally.
European Social Forum.
If you speak of European Social Forum, I agree. But I agree that after Istanbul, it seems to be very difficult to hold a new one. And the previous ones were not successes either. In Sweden, there were many people, but there were no Swedes. Yes, Malmö. Sorry, it was not Stockholm. So this relates to the what we call European. I don't think there is such a thing as Europe, which overarches various nations. We are Europe, each of us. We are a bit of Europe. There is no such thing as a sort of overarching entity. And struggles are national struggles, each within its confines, with its difficulties, its specificity. Of course, struggles in Greece will influence struggles in Spain and vice versa, etc. But the European social movement, as such, does not yet exist. There is no such thing as a European public sphere, for many reasons, because of our different historical trajectories, before of languages too. We have in the EU, we have 23 official languages, with Croatian that will be 24, and etc., etc. So before there is such a thing as a European social sphere or social or public sphere or public space, we must know each other better. You have no idea, for example, Eric is Belgian. One of the countries which is least known in France is Belgium. Brussels is 1.5 hours away from Paris by train. But as a journalist, for example, when I was on the board of Le Monde Diplomatique, when we wanted to have an article on Belgium, we could not find one single French specialist of Belgium. We had to resort to Belgians themselves, and there are plenty of very good journalists. So the French ignore Belgium completely. They go to Brussels, but they have no interest in the very complex mechanisms of Belgian political and very sophisticated problems of Belgium. No, we have to know our neighbors first, Spain, Italy, and not only as tourists. So when there is, for example, a meeting with 2 delegates from each of the 27 members of the EU, we think it's a European meeting. I think it's completely pointless. On the contrary, if you have 50 Croatians and 50 Belgians discussing together, that's a brick. There are 2 bricks together which will build the house of Europe. So we have to rethink what we call Europe and not consider that we have achieved what remains to be achieved, and the creation of a European social space is an objective, but it will take time, it will take efforts. We have to know to learn the history of our neighbors, to know their stereotypes, to have an inkling of their... Nobody, I'm sure that in this room, nobody could quote one musician, leading musician from each of the 27 countries. I couldn't, for example. For Croatia, my ignorance is unlimited. And you are soon a member of the EU.
Thank you, Bernard. So Eric, is your floor.
Yes. Yeah, it's clear that there is a crisis of European Social Forum. It's absolutely clear. Incapacity of convoking important gathering, etc. And it is related, I think, to what happens, and Alexandra made some references to that this morning. The crisis in Italy had a major impact on the European Social Forum because the Italian different social movement had an important influence and positive influence in the years 2000, 2001 until 2004. Okay, but there are a lot of reasons for the crisis, but that's a fact. That's also a fact that neither the Occupy Wall Street movement and the indignators or in Spain or the occupant in the Sintagma place, they didn't refer to the World Social Forum. That's not a reference for them. Including the majority of the people don't know the existence of the World Social Forum, and I don't speak about the majority of the population. I speak about the majority of the activists who participate to the movement now. So there is a rupture of continuity. We have a new generation, and in this generation who organize the movement, clearly there are old cadres which have participated to the European Social Forum and who could bring some experience and some positive things. But we have to understand the veterans of the European Social Forum that a period is finished. And we enter in a new period, and we have to relate the previous experience of the last decade with the new experience of the new generation. Not only young people, but in Spain, I was invited to several meetings of the indignators of Puerta del Sol and Barcelona. There are people of 50, 60 years old who are participating for the first time in their life in such a big radical movement. Because, for instance, there are people who lost the house due to the crisis of the real estate bubble in Spain. So there are young people with diplomas, without job, who are mobilizing themselves, but you are also people of 50 years old or 60 years old. And the same, I think, in the US, you are also older and young people. So that's a new generation. And so what could we try to do to answer Roland's question from Poland? I don't think we could create now one big global network at the world scale. It would be something which will not represent really the movement. I think nobody could say, I represent the movement. No forces could represent the movement. So the question now, I don't say that in 2 years or 3 years that it is impossible to do that, but I say now it's impossible. It would be totally a substitute to the movement and something superficial. And we don't. One of the lessons I think is that people don't want anymore vanguard. They don't want Leninist parties. They don't want Maoist parties. They don't want vanguard. They don't know people who say we are the political bureau of the movement and we will say to you what do you have to do. No. People is not for that reason. I think what was saying the Greek person this morning, Kostas, I don't know, is Kostas Douzinas, was interesting because there's something real at this level. So, how do this spontaneous movement could really organize himself? That's the question. What type of structure, what type of delegation of power, what platform, what planning of activity, what agenda? That's a real challenge for the movement, and it's complicated to find a solution. There are some initiatives, I think, positive initiatives. For instance, I don't know how many persons here in the room know that experience now. The name is Joint Social Conference. So veterans of the European Social Forum are meeting with Attac, with my movement, CADTM, and the big trade union in something which name itself Joint Social Conference. And we held the meeting in Brussels end of March, which was very interesting because a lot of participants for East Europe and Western Europe and Central Europe was participating. And the idea is to help to make convergence. For instance, we wrote 5 days ago a letter to all the movement telling that there are now 8 appeals at European level for different type of activities. And we say we will not be able to make a single common appeal because nobody is capable to say we will gather everybody on the same appeal. So we say, we propose, because we know this appeal and they are, for different reasons, they have specificities, but they are in the correct direction, I would say. We propose to each movement to sign all the 8 appeals, if they agree. and to make some publicity for the CADTM. We wrote an appeal for the citizen audit of the debt, and we create with other forces like Attac, etc., a new international network which name is ICANN, International Citizen Audit Network. It was created the 7th of April in Brussels with delegates from 12 countries. But it's one of the several networks, and we want to work inside the Joint Social Conference with the other networks, with the Transnational Institute and the CEO think tank and all other movements. People here from the Subversive Festival was participating also to this meeting. So that's something, but very modest. We don't want to proclaim ourselves as a new structure who will organize the things. We will try to make better the collaboration with what really exists now at European level. And that's a first step, I think, in a modest but a constructive step.
Thank you. So we have to finish in a few minutes. Thanks, Eric. So perhaps, because of what you mentioned, the long wave, to give us a short wave on historic long wave.
I don't understand your question. How can I be short on that? I'll be very short on continuing what Eric said. I think that we ought to be, and we are all, very modest with. I think when the World Social Forum had its first edition in 2001, it was a very positive initiative. I'm among those, and it seems that we are convinced of that maybe the page is turned now. For sure, the major movements which started changing balance of forces did not come out of organizations which were present in the social forum, and they even ignored its existence. Now there is, with the diminishing role of the World Social Forum, the increasing place of the NGOs instead of really movements in struggle within the World Social Forum, perhaps. So this page is turned. I think that Eric is fully positive in the proposals, the modest proposals, but important, that there are other forms which will be invented progressively. Perhaps more at the regional level than at global level, because conditions are so different, including communication, languages, and so on, and political cultures, that it is difficult. Now, we will have to discuss in 2 days, the day after tomorrow, of the proposal for a social forum for the Balkans. I'm very positive. I'm not with this initiative. I don't pay attention to the name. Call it as you want. Since social forum was a phrase which was used, why not to continue? But it will be something very different. It's not a a Balkanic sub network of an existing and glorious, continuing and expanding World Social Forum. Thank you.
Thanks, Samir. That's it for tonight. And there is a talk in a few minutes or 15 or whatever break. Thanks everyone, and I hope it was useful, the time spent here.